And welcome to Hi Friends. Jim Candeline here. It's always a pleasure to spend an hour with you, and this is going to be a most intriguing hour. I have a new book by Alan N. Young. It's entitled Justice Defiled, and the subheading is Perverts, Potheads, Serial Killers, and Lawyers. And Alan is a professor of law at Osgood, which is a part of York University, as you know, and very well known as a place to train lawyers. He's also a television commentator. He was CTV's link to the Bernardo trials a few years ago. He's no stranger to many of you who watch television. You often see him making comment on various things, including the legalization of marijuana. And he's a bit of an iconoclast. Actually, he's a lot of an iconoclast. But he has some very insightful perspective. And I've just finished reading the book, and it really was a gripper. Alan, thanks so much for coming our way.
It's my pleasure
to have you.
Thank you very much.
You don't make any bones about it. Right off the top, you say people basically hate lawyers.
Sure. Well, I knew that coming into the profession, and I've been in the profession 20 years, and I didn't see anything change. I'm not out to embarrass or humiliate lawyers, but I got to tell you, I was on a television show talking about lawyers being a cancer on society. And I say a lot of extreme things, as you mentioned in your opening. And usually people ignore the things I say. Suddenly, everyone's calling me about this comment, including 3 publishers. They all say they want a book on lawyers as a cancer. And I say, I don't have a death wish. It's not really my interest. I wanted to move out of the profession quietly. But the more I thought about it, I thought after 20 years, I did have a lot to say. And I thought the public had a right to know some of the things that I called maybe the hidden secrets. So I thought, oh, what the hell, I'll be a whistleblower and see if I can actually get people to pay attention to real justice, not television justice. And that's kind of how it came about.
Well, you make what appears to be an outrageous statement earlier on in the book when you say that law is about oppression. Now, once I read the book, I understood what you were talking about, but most of us would not see law as an oppressive thing, and yet you make it very clear that for many people it is.
Well, it's a coercive force. That's what law is. We allow people to carry guns and enforce the law. We give judges the ability to imprison people. So it's always a coercive force. You have to know that to know we shouldn't rely upon it for every social problem, because coercive forces can get out of control. Power corrupts. We have to start with that. So we need law. We need criminal law. Even in a city of angels, we're going to have traffic lights. But if you understand that it comes from the heart of oppression, you're going to be more constrained and restrained in terms of using the law. And every time you see a problem you don't like, you're not going to go to Parliament and say, create a new criminal law. And that's really my starting predicate for the book and for my perception of law.
Yeah, and you make it very clear, especially in the first 7 chapters, that you really take issue with the law in terms of its intrusion on what you call pleasure seeking.
Well, that's my life. I mean, that's my professional and my personal life. I mean, really, since I was in high school, because I was in the drug subculture, I saw people being stigmatized and punished for alternative lifestyles. It just turns out that when I became a lawyer, most of my work was in the sex trade and the drug trade, and now I saw it escalate. It wasn't just high school people being nabbed for possession. It was, my first trial was a huge drug conspiracy trial. I met all 25 importers of hash. I liked them all. They were all nice people. Yet at the end of the day, many of them served 10, 15 years in jail, and I thought, there's something wrong in our system where people that I like, meaning people that aren't dangerous, people that really are fun to be around, they can't harm society, are spending such long periods of time in jail. And then the weird thing was I'd do some sexual assault cases and see that they would get probation or 30 days, and it didn't jive. I thought, we have misplaced priorities. We're going after the hedonists with a fury, and the people that are scary to me, that I think scare society, we were giving a lot of kisses to. And that's really what propelled me into wanting to liberate the pleasure seekers, because I felt, hey, if we get rid of the pleasure seekers out of criminal justice, maybe we'll really focus on the serious predatory crimes like the sex assaults, the robberies, and start doing justice. And at a very young age, probably the first year as a lawyer, I said, that's what I want to do. Get rid of the baggage that we brought from Victorian times into our law. Make criminal law about security and order in the community. And I've tried, to contribute in my own small way. I don't know if I've been successful, and maybe the book will be my greatest success in terms of moving the law in that direction.
Well, you make a very profound point. I forget where it is, chapter 8, 9, somewhere in there, about people who have impoverished, dreary lives are more inclined to seeking some kind of oblivion or relief or release in drug abuse than people who, to all intents and purposes, are well adjusted. And you know, This struck me because in the work that I do in Africa, a big part of the HIV/AIDS issue relates to the ever-present reality of poverty.
Sure.
Misery seeks relief.
No question. First of all, with drugs, the one thing society hasn't accepted yet is there's use and there's abuse. Not everybody who uses an illicit drug is abusing it. Now, the people that tend to abuse it are the people that don't have the social network to protect themselves. I think I make the comment that you're more likely to drown in a pool of your own vomit in the inner city than you are in your swimming pool. And I think there's truth to it. And you know, all those heroin junkies who were in Vietnam fighting the war for the States, they come back out of the horror of Vietnam. Where are all the junkies? They sort of disappeared because they didn't have as much of a compelling need to abuse heroin. So the drug issue really masks the problems of society. We blame drugs for the disintegration of our cities, the fact that our young people aren't doing as well in academic testing. It isn't about that. It's about lifestyle conditions and about the fact there still is enormous poverty and lack of opportunity for a large sector of society. Those people who will be exposed to drugs in the same way me as a middle-class person will be might end up abusing it because there's not alternatives for them. I've used drugs for 30 years. I've made good, responsible choices about drug-taking behavior because I've had a lot to live for, and I've had a lot of privilege in my life. So I'm not going to throw it away by being stupid and recklessly becoming an addict. So I do believe it's all about set and setting, and we've done a real disservice to society in demonizing the drug itself.
We'll take a little break here. Alan Young is my guest. The book is entitled Justice Defiled. We are just into our conversation, and it's a most intriguing one, to say the least. We'll be back with more right after this short break. Welcome back. Jim Catalan here. This is Eye to Eye. Justice Defiled is the book. The author is Alan Young. He's professor of law at Osgoode. You also teach criminology at the University of Toronto.
That was partly because I got tired of training law students, because a lot of my books about lawyers' side, reducing the number of lawyers, I felt this is a moral conundrum. I'm graduating 300 a year. So the last 4 years I've taken leave of the law school and I'm teaching criminology students.
By the way, your chapter on law school, Training Mr. Nice Guy? What's it called?
Training and Education, Mr. Bastard.
Oh, that's what it was. Yeah, I'm close.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get to that,
Yes.
because it's a rather jaundiced view of law school. And
I know, and I'm negotiating my return to the law school while that chapter's out there, so it's becoming a bit interesting.
But maybe just picking up on that, you really see lawyers in the justice system as bad guys, essentially predatory, taking advantage of. In fact, you know, I was going to ask you to read this. Page 235, I think.
You want me to read it?
Yeah, I think.
I'm an old guy. I may need my reading glasses.
Well, I can read it for you if you can.
Thank you.
Okay, we know people hate lawyers.
Yes.
A lot of this contempt is mixed with disdain for the system itself, and I've already addressed some of the systemic failures that tarnish the image of criminal justice in the eyes of ordinary Canadians. But the legal profession is not just an innocent messenger for a bad system. There's something about the culture of the lawyer that is ugly and contemptible. You say legal culture is a culture of arrogance and condescension. It's a culture of argument and confrontation. For the right fee, lawyers will argue that black is white and white is black, and they'll argue with vigor and passion. And you also make the point that you can be sure when you hire a lawyer, the lawyer sees you basically as an idiot.
They're knowledge elites, yeah.
They're knowledge elites, and you're a dummy. You're an ignoramus.
Oh, and we train people to think in those ways, because the whole idea is you can't represent yourself because you're too stupid to speak for yourself. You need a lawyer. So there's a lot of that arrogance and condescension. The thing that I really found difficult was the culture of argument, that everything's an issue, and life is just too short to argue over everything. There reaches a point, I think, we have to look at institutions as collaborative enterprises, but in our society, everything's a competitive exercise. Everything's a sports motif. And we brought it. This idea of a clash of two teams, two opposites will get us truth in a court. I don't like that anymore. I don't see it actually happening. I'd like to see it to be a collaborative effort between all the public officials and an independent lawyer who represents the accused. Culture of argument is like this Japanese monk said, it's a thunder which brings no rain. It's a lot of noise, you've got a lot of attention, but ultimately when you look at what's happened at the end of the argument, it hasn't nourished the soul. And that's kind of why I felt I had to get out of law for a while, because I felt my spirit was being diminished by the fact that I had my edge. I was a good cross-examiner. I was sharp in argument, but I lost my balance. I never felt sort of at peace and settled because I was always ready for the argument. You say black, I have to say white. Now how do I think of the arguments to say white? And I just felt that that's not really a very authentic way to live.
Is this essentially a spiritual conundrum? Like, does this say Alan Young has a conscience?
No question.
And the conscience somehow is out of sync? It's dissonant with the courtroom?
No question. I'm not a religious person, and you could probably tell from the book. I mean, I'm blasphemous at times, but I do believe in spirituality. I believe there is a higher goal for the human spirit. And everything I see in terms of our bureaucratic institutions diminishes that spirit. And I think that's really the main reason why I wanted to distance myself from the profession. And then when I was distant a bit, I could look at it and maybe make recommendations to make it a more compassionate profession, because law is about conflict, and we need compassion to solve conflicts. We don't need argument. Forget criminal law, look at matrimonial law. Two people in marital discord go to lawyers, and the first thing they're doing is telling you how much you should get out of it, not what's good for you in your life, and they aggravate the conflict. Lawyers are in a conflict of interest in dealing with conflicts because they get money by aggravating the conflict. So we've got to get a lot of these lawyers out of these conflict situations.
You say rather acerbically that the average idealistic law student says he's there to change the world and seek justice, but really what he wants is a BMW.
Well, it's true. And look, I don't fault them. I went to law school largely to satisfy my parents. It was not a dream of mine. We all, look, when we're young people, we're drifting. We don't know where we want to go. Some people have a clear idea. So we're attracted to professions that give us both money and prestige. And those are really bad motivations for dedicating the rest of your life. That was my motivation, too. Hopefully, you start to really want to help people, and I do have students and lawyers who want that, but most of the time you just buy into the system, which is get into a big firm, start your salary at $80,000, pray that they'll bring you on as partner, and then you've got your $170,000 a year. No time to enjoy it, but at least you've reached that upper echelon of life.
In terms of public policy, you say, we're just groping in the dark. That's kind of depressing.
Very depressing.
Does the justice system clear or muddy the darkness?
Muddies, no question about it. See, we are groping in the dark. See, what happened was in the 50s, with the rise of behavioral sciences, we truly believe we break the code of violence and we could rehabilitate people. All the discussion in the 1960s was about rehabilitation. We realized in the 70s we don't know much about the human condition, and we gave up on rehabilitation. And that's sad. We will learn. We will continue to learn. But the one thing that happens is when you take behavioral science and you bring it into court, the lawyers and the legal professionals, they reconvert and filter that reality, so they make it even muddier. What we need to do is, again, that word collaborative, a collaborative mission between social sciences and the legal professionals. We need to understand criminality to control it. All we do is process people. We bring them in. We have to prove you have the actus reus, the guilty act, the mens rea, the who, what, when, and where of crime. But when we get to the question of why this happened, everyone runs and hides. And you're not going to improve society until we answer the why. We're far away from being able to do that. But we shouldn't have given up in the 60s just because we couldn't figure out break the code for violence.
Has there ever been a time in your knowledge of human law history where this ideal that you have just expressed came close to being realized?
Not really, but at least in the original forms of law, it was more civil. It was more private parties. We didn't delegate responsibility to professionals, so people who had a passionate interest in the result were having carriage of the case. That doesn't necessarily explain the why of the situation, but it comes a lot closer because it's authentic. The people involved are speaking for themselves. So there was a time historically, in fact, most criminal justice after Anglo-Saxon times till really the 19th century was privately driven. There was a lot of system problems with it, system efficiency, and as crime rates increased during industrialization, we did need a professional response. But boy, I really regret the fact people don't speak for themselves.
Well, you know, you, in Chapter 10, which is entitled Our Criminal Code, You quote part of the criminal law in Canada that you essentially agree with. In fact, you say, I couldn't agree more. If this were actually true, I would not be writing this book. Let me just share some of it. The basic theme in stressing that the criminal law ought to be reserved for reacting to conduct that is seriously harmful. The harm may be caused or threatened to the physical safety or integrity of individuals or through interference with their property. It may be caused or threatened to the collective strategy or integrity of society. Since many acts may be harmful and since society has many other means for controlling or responding to conduct, criminal law should be used only when the harm caused or threatened is serious, and when the other, less coercive or less intrusive means do not work or are inappropriate.
Those are all the theoretical commentary you get starting with J.S. Mill in 1850 on liberty. You only use criminal law for serious harm to others. In fact, it's part of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man in the 18th century. But lawmakers, they seem to support it, but they don't act in accordance with it. And because there's a lot of politics that really compromises the theory. So the thing is, if someone think there's a social problem, like the bikers were having a war in Quebec. So they create new laws called anti-biker laws. Well, they had laws against extortion, murder. They have enough laws to go after the bike organizations. But the police in Quebec wanted it, so it was a political coup to give that, so the police in Quebec felt empowered. And then we end up burdening our criminal code, making it more fat, making it more complex. So we've really gone far astray from that basic theoretical notion, which everybody has pretty much accepted. It's the heart of liberalism. Law is a blunt instrument, should be used with restraint. We always say it, but we never really respect the principle.
You make the point, too, in the book that we almost make up law as we go along. I'll take a little break here. Alan Young is my guest. The book is Justice Defiled. A fascinating discussion here. We'll be back with more right after this short break. And we're back. Jim Canline here. You're watching Eye to Eye. Alan Young is my guest. He's professor of law at Osgoode Hall, or at least has taken a break from that. Teaches criminology at the University of Toronto. He's also now running his recently deceased father's business. And what else do you do when you have a break?
I write columns for the Toronto Star on a bi-weekly basis.
Television commentary?
I do television. And the only legal work I continue to do is the pot work, because we've come close. And I do a lot of work with victims' rights.
Okay, now in the book here, it says that this is the little bio.
The bio, yes.
On the leaf. He is primarily responsible for the establishment of a medical marijuana program in Canada. Really?
I guess so. I mean, there's a little bit of self-promotion, but no, the reality is the litigation that I conducted in southwestern Ontario over the last 10 years compelled the government to set up a program. I had a client, an AIDS patient, named James Wakeford, and we got a court to grant him a constitutional exemption to use marijuana. And the judge basically said, really, this is something the government should deal with. And so the government responded and created a program. I must admit, it's a horrible program, so I don't like to sort of take responsibility for creating it. But I did. I sort of provided the impetus and the motivation for Health Canada to do it. The reason why I said to you I continue this work is because they haven't done it properly, and I will not stop doing the work until the program is set up properly. What I am going to do to sort of diversify is I'm bringing in corporate interests into this mix, because pharmaceutical companies won't push marijuana as a medicine, so I'm bringing in other corporate interests. There's a lot of rich potheads out there, by the way. And they're going to help me construct a really valuable clinical trial and a medical program so thousands of people can try marijuana to determine if it helps with their symptomology. We may be sitting on the next great panacea. I don't want to overstate it, but we might be, and it's a shame that this government's not backing it, because really the only point of organized society is to reduce suffering. So if we have something that's going to help reduce people's suffering, let's do it.
Okay, now there's some listening to you right now who are saying, now, is this not a slippery slope? There's some horrible effects of the abuse of drugs out there in our world. As I picked it up from reading your book, your view is that we're much better off to have control of the system and legalize things rather than have a dark kind of other world, giving people drugs that are impure. There's a whole culture and a whole economy there of the underworld.
Sure.
What you're saying is if I got it right, if we legalize things and control things, then suddenly that dark underworld has no further existence.
You got it completely right. Most of the evils that we talk about when we talk about drugs are a product of creating a black market. Violence. There's gang slayings over drugs because it is a very expensive commodity in a black market. You erase that. People die in the streets of Vancouver from injecting impure heroin or heroin that hasn't been stepped down as much as their previous sample. These things wouldn't happen in a standardized approach. See, the most important point is most drugs can be used responsibly. That's the most important point. 5–10% of people who use drugs will fall through the cracks and have horror stories. The state should be providing a safety net for those people. It's silly to say just don't do it and then criminalize all the activities surrounding it when 95 or 90% of the users are harmless. So we're creating a social problem with our drug laws. We've hurt a lot of people. I've seen people hurt. I tell the story in my book of showing up at a birthday party December 1st, 1999 and shooting the kid's dog because they thought it was a pot growing operation. If they didn't look for pot and didn't criminalize, they wouldn't be going in as SWAT teams into people's homes. They really don't do that much for other offenses. We use a lot of intrusive measures in the drug trade because of the consensual activity. There's no victim to complain to the police, to have the police react. So the police become proactive. It corrupts the police. It corrupts society. It increases violence on the streets. And just to stop some people from seeking alternative forms of pleasure doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And we spend a lot of money on this.
Now, is it Holland who have taken steps further than most nations in terms of the legalization of various kinds of drugs?
It's more important to realize that we are totally out of step with the world. All of Europe, except for 4 countries, have effectively decriminalized. Most of Australia has effectively decriminalized. England just last month reclassified marijuana to make it non-arrestable. So actually the whole world is changing. The only reason we don't feel it is because we're north of the United States, which has the most repressive criminal justice system in the world, other than maybe some third world nations that really don't have formal legal institutions.
Well, as you can see, friends, those of you who are listening in here, Justice Defiled is certainly controversial, to say the least.
I must say, just on that point, just on the marijuana point, it is somewhat controversial, though I must say public opinion supports what I do on this issue. Most people think that a criminal law is an inappropriate response to marijuana. Where my book becomes heretical, as I say, it's the same thing with the harder drugs. The risks are increased, but it's the same principled issue.
You know something that just kind of grabbed my soul when I was reading your book? You say, in court, virtually every case started off with the accused getting drunk.
Yeah. When I was a young lawyer, the first time I was a law student, I was sent to what was called county court at the time to be placed with the judge. I noticed 2 things. One, every story started off with people drinking, and secondly, that everyone in court as an adult had a juvenile record. It's not like you wake up as an adult and become a criminal. So it's interesting in terms of what we've decided to legalize in terms of drug use, is that we have ended up legalizing the most criminogenic drug possible because alcohol is a disinhibitor. Most drugs make you a little bit inhibited and a bit paranoid. And as a disinhibitor, people do really stupid things. So you find lots of cases where, let's say there's a feud between 2 neighbors, we'll give an example. What will happen will be someone will drink enough to give them this expression, it's called Dutch courage, I don't know where it came from, so they can get their rifle and go threaten the person. And you know, because the person's drunk, chances are that finger's going to slip on the trigger, and you know there's going to be a manslaughter or murder case. And I've just described most serious crime. Alcohol is a big part, probably 65% of all homicides in this country are committed by people under the influence of alcohol. My drug, marijuana, it's never going to happen. People are just too laid back and can't get off the couch. You do get problems with heroin, but not because of heroin. Heroin makes you want to stay on the couch. But the thing is, it's very addictive. So if the supply is cut off, you will end up committing secondary crime to satisfy your habit. But there's only one drug, I say not true. I find the amphetamines can also be criminogenic. The amphetamines and alcohol, which actually drive people to exercise really poor judgment, act out of character, harm people, and then cry afterwards and say the whiskey made me do it. No, you did it, and you've got to learn how to drink responsibly. Most people do, luckily, but alcohol is very dangerous.
Would you agree or disagree that alcoholism is a disease?
Oh, most definitely, and that's what I talked about, safety nets. The state has an obligation to create safety nets for people who harm themselves with any drug, whether it be counseling, addiction services, whatever the people need, because that's where the harm to society starts to set in. When people acquire addictions, they can't satisfy their habits, they hurt their families, they hurt their communities. If the state would step in a non-criminal way and say, we can help you, we're not going to criminalize and stigmatize you, we can reduce the type of cost to society from drug use, because there's always costs.
Yeah. Boy, time is just flying by here, Alan. We'll have to take another break here. The book is called Justice Defiled. It's published by Key Porter, Perverts, Potheads, Serial Killers, and Lawyers. Written by a lawyer, and a most intriguing read. Back with more right after this. And we're back, and just to inform those of you who may be joining us, the book is called Justice Defiled. You're watching Eye to Eye. I'm Jim Canelon. The guest is Alan Young. He's a professor of law. He's a man who's had a lot of experience in the criminal law courts. And this book he's written, Justice Defiled, is a pretty stunning book in terms of exposing the layman, like me, to the world of the justice system. And it's absolutely, it's not the kind of book that gives you a lot of good feelings, Alan. I mean, I read it and I'm disturbed by a lot of what you say.
It's depressing, but I think that's why I hope people find a lot of humor throughout it. People tell me it's actually very funny, and actually I've been accused of not making sound arguments but just looking for a good laugh. But that was intentional, because the content is depressing, and if you were to take out the laughs out of this book and just read it without the laughs, you would never want to walk into a courtroom, you would never want to shake hands with a lawyer, and you just wish that you would have a blessed life if you never have to have a legal claim against you or that you have to make yourself.
Right. There's a lot of feeling out there in Canada these days that the Supreme Court has gone too far. Mm-hmm. Feeling that the Supreme Court are basically making decisions that the Parliament should make, and that the Parliament is basically hiving off issues to the Supreme Court because they don't want to confront them, they don't want to alienate some of their supporters. And there's various issues that we could discuss in those terms. But the thing that really challenged me as I read your book was what you refer to as the elevation of lawyers to the exalted position of the judge. And your point is that there's nothing transformational about that elevation. And if someone has been a dark soul, a predatory kind of lawyer, what's to stop him being that way when he's suddenly sitting on the bench?
I have always had confronted some very bad judges. There's some very good judges, but we see the bad judges. We know who they are. And one day I was teaching, and I was looking at my class, and I get to know my law students pretty well. There's very good law students, but there's 10% that are bordering on psychotic almost, really people that I'm not sure why they're there. And when I was watching them, I realized that the only thing you really need to become elevated is 10 years minimum experience and a connection. There's still a lot about who you know. And I was looking at these people and going, oh my God, some of these people I'm teaching that will get a very low C in criminal law in my class will end up making decisions about whether or not you get to spend the rest of your life at home or in jail. And that horrified me. And I started to sort of scratch the surface a bit more and realize, yes, I mean, we put them in robes, we elevate them literally on their dais, we stand when they walk, we call them Your Honor, in some jurisdictions, My Lord. And I realized that was all a mask to make sure that we didn't actually scratch below the surface and see they're just ordinary lawyers. There's no school for judges. They don't acquire the wisdom of Solomon. And this is all very human. It's not really anything spectacular what I'm saying, but because we've created the illusion that they are sage people, we've done a disservice. Once we recognize that they're just ordinary people with warts and blemishes just like us, the profession will improve and justice will improve, because it'll be less about elitism and about knowledge elites thrusting their views on people, but there'll be more commonality between the people and the legal professionals. And you know what? It's okay to say judges make mistakes, judges screw up. We don't want to say that. We feel we can say it about politicians, we can say it about lawyers. Suddenly with judges, we're being trained, brainwashed, because they got the ermine robes and they stand up high, not to say unpleasant, impolite things about them. That's why the worst chapter I wrote, The Illusion of Wisdom, is about judges, worse in terms of what I consider profanity and hard-hitting, because I really wanted to hit these people, because I feel they have to be part of the culture and the community and not this sort of great sage, because they're not. If they were, if maybe we sent people to monasteries for 10 years to meditate and to really work on themselves spiritually, and then we appointed them as judges, yeah, I'd give them the robes, I'd call them your sage or whatever, but I can't do that for people that maybe the year before I was doing a case with and I was sitting there thinking, you're an idiot. So, I mean, there should be something transformational about it, but there isn't, and we have to recognize that, and we have to recognize judges are ordinary people, and we have to help them make their decisions, and criticize them when they're wrong, and condemn them when they're really wrong, and not treat them as very fragile bureaucrats that really just have to be given their free rein to decide what's just.
When a judge comes out with a judgment, sometimes we hear it's 100, 120, 130 pages. That's an awful lot of writing.
Judges can work very hard. Some are extremely lazy, but let me tell you, I've been doing this a long time. 120 pages, you got to look at the structure of it, because first of all, there's going to be 20, 30 pages which are just recitation from other courts. There's a lot of filler. I'm not taking away from the hard work that a judge puts into it, but hey, I write academic articles that are 60, 70 pages, and 30% of it, 40% of it is quotations and fillers. It's pretty easy to write a long judgment. When I started as a law student, it would take me hours and hours to read a judgment. Now I can read almost any judgment, even the 120 pages, in 5 minutes, because I know exactly where the BS is, where the filler is, and where the tiny little kernel of a judgment is.
Now, when you have the Supreme Court and you've got several judges hearing a case, do they have to come up with some kind of a collaborative, consensual judgment ultimately? How does that process work?
It's interesting. I was a clerk at the Supreme Court in 1981, and I know a little bit about it, but it changes year to year. No, we don't do it as a collaborative exercise. It's interesting because in Europe, their high constitutional courts speak in one voice. You can't have a dissenting judgment. Here we can have, this is one of the problems with the Supreme Court, 9 judges, you can have 5 judges writing, and then you don't know really what the law is. And that's great for lawyers. Ambiguity is what pays our bills, right? So it's great for lawyers, but I think for the public, they must be freaking out when they get a big judgment from the Supreme Court of Canada, 150 pages, and realize 5 different people wrote. One judge concurs with this judge, one concurs with that judge. You've got to count up the heads, and you don't actually know what the law is as a result. And as I said, that's one of the hidden secrets of law, the amount of ambiguity. Everybody thinks the law is like a science. A leads to B, leads to C, and it's just a flow chart and you have resolute determinate answers. No, we are mired in ambiguity. The more ambiguity, the better, because if the Supreme Court doesn't speak in one voice, I get to go back in the low courts and say, you know what, you should really look to Justice Lemaire's decision or Justice Deschamps' decision. Those are the ones. So we just keep repeating and re-arguing the same points, and it keeps us in business and allows us as law professors to keep graduating 350 people every year just from Osgood itself. Ambiguity is our lifeblood.
What's easier, to argue a case before a judge or to argue a case before a jury?
You know what, honestly, I've only been observers at jury trials. People tell me I should do jury trials, but the nature of the work I ended up doing once I was a lawyer on my own was work you wouldn't want to do in front of a jury, sort of more complicated legal arguments that juries can't hear anyways. I don't know what'd be harder to. I guess I'm so well trained in arguing in front of judges, it's second nature. The idea of arguing in front of 12 ordinary people scares me, but quite frankly, I think it's probably easier if you drop the elitism and the condescension and you talk at their level.
What wins the day with a judge or a jury for that matter, style or substance?
Bit of both. A bit of both.
You have to be a communicator, right?
No question about it. And see, that's the thing. We lawyers say this, right? I want a case. What does that mean, I want a case? Either justice was done or it wasn't done. And I tell my students that from day one, I don't want to ever hear you say you won or lost a case. The first time they do a case from the legal clinic, they come running up to me, I want a case. You can't get rid of that competitive exercise. So much turns on the lawyer's performance. And to me, in a principled justice system, the performance of the professionals would be completely erased. It really would not be part of it. Lawyers should be boring conveyors of information. They should not be involved in rhetoric, because then it makes it a performance. And that's why there's so many television shows about lawyers. It should be boring. We've made it into an image of exciting drama, that lawyers are performing and they're doing great soliloquies. I don't like that about law.
Well, let's take a break from our soliloquy here, and we'll let you watch a little business, and we'll be back with more of Alan Young and Justice Defiled right after this. And we're back with Alan Young, Justice Defiled, the book. Alan, we've been talking a lot here about just the inner sanctum of the justice system. A couple of cases that most people can relate to. One, the O.J. Simpson case,
Sure.
the other, the Bernardo Homolka case. Johnny Cochran became a media star,
Sure.
as did Alan Dershowitz.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned winning a case. Did Johnny Cochran win that case? Was justice served there as you watched and observed?
I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows whether justice was served, but actually the O.J. case is a great case to demonstrate the problems that are triggered when lawyers are front and center in the process. And he had a team of like 5 lawyers, the best lawyers in the United States. And whether they pulled the wool over the jury's eyes, I don't know. Whether they confused the jury to such a degree, I don't know what happened. It was one of those cases that it seemed like most people felt there was very strong proof of guilt. And the verdict is somewhat inexplicable. And when you see some of the hijinks and some of the rhetoric used by Johnny Cochran, I forget if it doesn't fit, acquit. I mean, it's like a Hallmark card greeting, but the fact is, those things are influencing ordinary people to make decisions that may not be consistent with the ends of justice.
The glove became the great symbol
Yes.
of that whole thing. But it was confusing for the average person, the layman like me, to have the criminal court say you're not guilty, but have the civil court say you are guilty.
Well,
how does that work?
Well, because there's different standards of proof. In the civil, you've only got to prove on a balance of probabilities. More likely than not, there's liability. Where in criminal, because the stakes are higher, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's actually silly that we have civil and criminal courts. We should merge them. It would do a lot for victims, because then they could have their monetary claims and other things addressed in the context of the criminal case. I think really when there's a breach of social order, we bring in professionals, we bring in the ordinary people, we bring in the victims, and we do everything at one time, civil and criminal. We separate the systems because of a constitutional quirk that we inherited from UK, and it's done a real disservice, because that's one of the ways we've been able to exclude victims, because we say, oh, you've got your civil route if you want to go after the offender. It'd be very nice to put them together, but we don't like efficiency in law. Again, inefficiency is the lifeblood because it gives us work.
You mentioned in the book that one of the most intriguing aspects of the Bernardo Homolka case was that they're such good-looking people.
Yeah.
And it's difficult for the public to associate heinous deeds with people who are photogenic.
Well, a lot of our moral judgments are actually aesthetic judgments, and we don't realize that. Things that we find disgusting, we tend to say are immoral, and that's why we have all these laws relating to pornography and obscenity, where the reality is there's no correlation between the way people look and the deeds they do. I mean, we're really so silly about this because we want simple answers. And in the 19th and 18th century, we had the school of phrenology, where we could determine if you were a criminal by the shape of your skull.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, once they dug up the Marquis de Sade and the phrenologist said, oh, it looks like the skull of a priest, they realized they were on the wrong track. But we're always looking for simple answers, and the simple answers say ugly, hunchback, criminal. And I think it was interesting for the public to see Bernard and Homolka and see these two very calmly, sort of socially adept people who were doing these horrible, horrible things. I mean, it's a depressing lesson. I don't want to just always teach depressing lessons, but I really think a dose of reality is good once in a while. And they reached a point where I think everyone just assumed that to be a serial killer, you had to look like John Wayne Gacy, who was really quite a hideous man in my view, or something like that. And I think it's important to open up our eyes that nice-looking people, professional people, successful people commit crimes. They tend to get away with them more than the people who are aesthetically displeasing to us. So that's why we've got to be aware of
Was
this.
Homolka's sentence of 12 years
Joe.
a product of a plea bargain?
Yes. They had to do it, but it's because there's no rules. With plea bargaining, they could throw out the baby with the bathwater. You can't get 12 years for 3 deaths, especially one's your sister, 2 are stranger, teenagers. I mean, this is a horrible, horrible crime. There should be rules constraining plea bargaining. We had to do a deal with her because we had nothing for Bernardo. But if the criminal code said you can't go below 15 years or you can't go below 20 years and 3 homicides, she wouldn't have gotten such a sweet deal. She could get whatever the marketplace would give her, which is whatever her lawyer could push for. And you know how morally distasteful that is? You got to come down on your sentence, or else we're not going to cooperate to get at this horrible serial rapist and serial killer. It's the type of negotiation I wouldn't want to do. So I've always advocated the abolition of plea bargaining, allowing some minor negotiation to get accomplices on board because they're necessary evils, but we can't give them these unbelievable presents. I can't believe, based on the deeds that she did, that she will be free and liberated to live her life out at the age of 35. I just don't think that's justice.
Yeah, you mentioned the Monty Hall syndrome, the let's make a deal. And on television, that's so much a part of the dramatic series you see in and around law courts, the deal-making behind the scenes. And it gives the average public a pretty cynical and jaundiced view of whether or not justice can ever be served.
Well, that's that old expression I took from Lenny Bruce. In the halls of justice, the only justice is in the halls. That's a big problem because the justice should be in the open court, which the public has a right to. When I negotiate a plea with a Crown attorney, there's nobody there. There's just me, the Crown, and a cup of coffee. So the public's not part of it. So basically, legal professionals who have their own hidden agendas are setting our sentencing ranges because most judges just sleepwalk through this. They don't like to interrupt plea bargains. And so ultimately, in 90% of cases, justice is being created by legal professionals who aren't accountable to the public necessarily, though Crowns will say they are. And I think that's really unfortunate. And we have to do it because we got too many cases, 2.5 new charges a year. That's why it's so important, my message in the book, to scale down criminal justice. Let's just deal with the serious breaches of social order, because then we don't have to plea bargain anymore. We can have a contested trial with every serious case so that we know everything that happened, maybe even get to the question of why it happened, and start exercising some meaningful social control over these serious criminals, as opposed to wasting our time processing 1 million charges every year through plea bargains.
Then when the sentence is issued and the punishment begins, the prisons don't seem to be doing a very good job.
They're warehouses, that's all it is. You're just warehousing someone for a certain period of time, and in fact, you're entrenching their criminality because people will live by the labels we give them. So if you send someone away for 5 years and we call them a criminal, the chances are they will make good friends, because you've got to make friends in any place you're at, and they will just become further entrenched in the criminal subculture because we're not providing them opportunities. Prisons should be last resorts to warehouse really serious criminals because we need to incapacitate them. No one else should be there. If I rip you off for money, even big amount of money, why am I going to jail? What interest that's serving? Why don't you make me do community service? Why don't you make me work for you? Give me a sense of social responsibility, because all I've shown before is greed. Even impaired driving that doesn't cause death. I mean, why are we throwing people in jail or fining them? Why are we taking away their cars and making them prove to us that they can drive responsibly? We're never attacking the root causes of behavior. We're just, here, pay some money, get out of my sight. Go to jail, get out of my sight. Everything's about out of sight, out of mind. It's so gray, it's so faceless. No wonder we've never felt like criminal justice is actually helping enhance security in society. People still think crime rates are going up, even though they've been going down for about 10 years, because that's the feeling criminal justice leaves us.
I want to spend what's left in this segment and then into the next one.
Sure.
With something that, again, really struck me as I was reading your book. You talk about the whole process of a criminal becoming a criminal. You raise 4 categories: formally labeled, morally indifferent, state-raised, sadistically cruel.
Yes.
And then the ultimate result is alienation.
Well, alienation is what fuels you going through those steps.
So alienation fuels you through the steps. Let's talk about this. Some kid on a lark does something that transgresses the criminal code and goes through the process and suddenly has a criminal record. He's not necessarily a criminal.
No.
But he is formally labeled a criminal.
Yes. And that may end up becoming a badge of honor that he'll live by, depending on what his social network is like. The key with young people and minor crime is don't dramatize the evil. Don't take them to criminal court. We should have community tribunals. They're much more effective in terms of imparting a moral conscience on people. The elevated judge sitting there with the robe being called Your Honor saying, Sonny, if I ever see you back here again, it's going to be trouble. I know how young people think. They're laughing at that. They think it's funny because it's giving them power, actually. They're up against the state. You put them around in a circle, like an Aboriginal sentencing circle, and you have neighbors and other people saying, you know, that was really awful what you did. I know it doesn't seem like a big deal breaking my window, but it's cost me $100. You know what? I don't have a job right now. And you go on like that. You infuse moral responsibility. You make them parts of a community. All we're doing with these minor crimes of young people is giving them the label and perhaps putting them on a path of criminality. And that's what I find sad, because we have a system which is self-perpetuating. Again, good for lawyers and business, not good for society.
Huh. Alan, I just, I'm not too sure where I'm at right now in terms of time. I think my earpiece is not working properly, so if there's a need to, I think there is a need to, I sensed it. We have to take a little break here right now, and we'll come back and talk about moral indifference and the state-raised criminal and the statistically cruel right after this. Don't go away. And Alan Young is my guest. We've had a great talk this hour on Justice Defiled. You know, you spend quite a bit of the book, I suppose it's self-deprecating humor, but you put yourself down quite a bit in this book.
Yeah, it's a technique.
Yeah, I thought it must be a technique, because this guy...
I actually have very low self-esteem, and I'm very happy you invited me on the show, because that's helping me with the problem, you know.
But you refer to yourself as a typical Jewish civil libertarian,
yeah.
And I think, you know, come on. I guess for the last 2 minutes, do you find what you're going through here, even the process of writing a book, a kind of a soul cleansing action? Is there something salubrious about this?
Oh, no question. I felt better after writing this book. In fact, when I was editing it, I was shocked at some of the anger. And if you could read the original manuscript, I mean, it is shocking. So obviously, I was exercising some demons. And I really have very strong views about the sort of disservice we're doing to the public. And so in writing it, it was a bit of a purge. I don't think it's necessarily improved anything in my life, but you know what's nice? I don't have to keep repeating myself about these things, other than on shows where we get to talk about it. I get to collect my thoughts all into one book, and that was, for me, very rewarding. And I guess there was a lot of anger and frustration. You know, I have those studies I talk about lawyer psychiatric distress. I see it all the time. I wanted to escape from that. I didn't want to become more neurotic than I think law school and the profession made me. And this is, I don't want to dramatize it and say on the road to recovery with this book, because I'm not recovering from anything. But something, yeah, there was something therapeutic about it. I can't really say anything beyond that.
We have 30 seconds. You have a child in the womb.
That's right, that's right. I got married earlier this year, and unexpectedly, because it wasn't part of the plan, I now have a child. And as I say in this book, and I'll say it more politely, I'm not a role model, but I guess now I'm going to have to start thinking in those terms.
I was going to say, you're going to have a son or a daughter there saying, hey, Dad, show me the way.
And by the way, this son or daughter can go to law school if they want. I still encourage people to go to law school. It's still one of the best degrees you can have, but keep your conscience and your compassion as you go through the process.
Oh, there you go. Conscience and compassion. And see, that's, to me, the prophetic thread through the book, because I think ultimately that's really what you're calling for.
Most definitely.
Alan Young, thanks so much for being with us. Justice Defiled is the book. I'm Jim Catalan. Thanks for being with us. See you again next time, friends.